Hello, Astrid and everyone else. Thank you very much for joining in this session. Special thanks to Astrid and to the Soil Association and to Innovative Farmers. I'm about to press the button, I think, which will transfer to my screen, which hopefully you'll be able to see. Can I just check with you, Astrid, that that has happened? Perfect. Okay, that's wonderful. I should say that I'm being helped this afternoon by Matt Johnson, who's not only going to help me this afternoon with this, but also has helped me with creating this presentation. So Matt, thank you. There are two of us here. Here we go. We've got less than an hour, a lot less than an hour, to cover 200 years. And I think it's fascinating to me that we've had this system of ley farming that has lasted for 200 years. If you think about it, what else lasts for such a long period of time? There are very few examples. And for that reason, I think it's just such an important subject matter to concentrate on, talking about leys that have stood the test of time, that have been the centre of farming systems for effectively 200 years. We've used the term Herbal Leys to head this presentation, but in fact we are really talking about diverse leys. And diverse leys needs a little definition before we start, just to be absolutely clear on what it is we're talking about. So when we're talking about diversity in terms of leys, these are effectively grass leys that form the hub, the centre of a farming rotation. These are more species, not just more varieties of the same species. In other words, not just 5 or 6 different ryegrasses or 5 or 6 different clovers, but more species. And I'm going to explain in some detail what I mean by this as we go on, but I just want to clarify it. Now, a herbal ley is an example, a good example of a diverse ley. So we're going to use that as our central theme as we go through this. But whatever we talk about in the next hour, we don't mean that this is the only mixture, the only type of mixture or composition of plants that we can use. It's an example, and you need to transfer the example into individual farming systems, and it's just so important to do that. So there's lots of others, but if we follow this pattern through, we'll hopefully be able to take it onto farms in a practical way. So why then do we look at these diverse leys, and what is it about them that has made them last for so long? Well, as far as I'm concerned, there are three things. One is the soil quality that they provide, because fundamentally in the rotation they are there to build soil quality, not just for the leys that they produce, but also for the cash crops that nearly always follow these leys. And these are temporary leys, don't forget. So I'm not talking about permanent pasture, but talking about leys that last for 3, 4 or 5 years in rotation and then followed by other crops. And I think it's so important to set the scene and to look at the historical context in which has enabled these herbal leys to become popular. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to look at the historical context and to start off by giving some really good, clear examples of why people use these sort of agricultural techniques in the past. So let's go back a couple of thousand years. Now that's a bit beyond my remit here because I did say only 200 years, but this is a lovely quote. This is from Cato, who wrote in De Rustica back in 234 BC. He says farmers should have a low cost of production and be a seller and not a buyer. And if you just think about the importance of that statement, it's so simple. How far away from that have we gone? How much money do we spend on the cost of production? We have all been trained to spend huge sums of money on the cost of production. And that has caused us a big problem in that our cost of production is too high. And I think Cato is absolutely right in that if you can spend very little money, you have a low cost, you have low risk, and your farming system can be much more profitable. Just think about the amount of money we spend on inputs now in terms of bought-in feed or fertilisers or pesticides, whichever you like to pick, they are jolly expensive and cost us a fortune. And we know that well enough. And I think farmers before us knew that well enough. And I'm now going to go back just about 200 years to a fellow, Arthur Young, who many of us have read about. No one, of course, knows that we don't know these people. They were many generations before us. But what I think is really important about Arthur Young is he had 50 years' experience as an agricultural writer. And he travelled all the way through England, Wales, Ireland, and eventually into France on a horse, writing about his experiences and recording, most importantly, recording the cropping and livestock production that was going on at the time. And he gave these lovely accounts in many, many different books or documents that he wrote. He actually wrote about the history of agriculture very much around the Norfolk, Suffolk region, but there are also accounts of him and the men that followed him in other regions, and here's one, for example, in Oxfordshire. But Arthur Young was very important because he wrote very clearly about what was going on, and he writes about chicory and burnet and sandfoin and all the sorts of plants that we're now becoming much more interested in once again. And my next person that I'm going to mention is Robert Elliott, and Robert Elliott got a lot of his thoughts from this guy, Arthur Young. Elliott, for me, is probably the single most important man that I'm going to mention today. He was a real pioneering farmer that unfortunately in his lifetime I don't think many people listened to. They listened to other people at the time, but what Elliott says, I believe, is of absolute fundamental importance. It was just 100 years ago, and agriculture at that time was unprofitable. It was depressed, and it was definitely in need of change. If ever there was something needed changing agriculturally, it was then, because there was no money at all in growing arable crops. There was lots of cheap imports coming into the country, and coupled with that, Elliott was a landowner, and he farmed a lot of his land was poor soil on the Scottish borders near Kelso. Elliott looked beyond all grasses being the same. He was one of the first people that identified that the grasses, and of course that also includes the clovers and the herbs that he loosely called grasses, and he realised that there was differences, particularly in terms of the depth of their root structures. And he, I believe, is the first person really that used herbal leys in the sense that we know of them now. He wrote a wonderful book called The Clifton Park Farming System, and I would urge you to read it. You can get it online, or you can buy an original copy. His book was only produced, I think, 1,000 copies at a time, and he had 3 or 4 editions of it at the end of his farming career. But he really tells you how to do this. He talks about self-sufficiency, just like Cato did. He talks about building soil quality with his wonderfully deep-rooting plants, and of course the low-cost forage that those leys produced. And it did definitely, without any shadow of a doubt, form the centre of his farming rotation. I think Elliott is a brilliant example, and I really, really urge you to if you have time, to follow his lead. What he says then is almost applicable now. Of course, nothing ever translates over 100 years, but fundamentally the backdrop was agriculture was depressed. There was too much money being spent on inputs. There was too much cheap commodity cereal in the marketplace, and these farmers were really going to the wall. And I think what he found by doing this, by developing a new system, which was largely based around deep-rooting leys, that he could find a way of farming profitably and increasing the most important thing on his farm, and that was the capital, the soil capital. In other words, he increased his fertility for his farming time and also for the next generations. Now, there's people that followed him, which I'm going to talk about now a little bit more quickly to keep moving along. And the next fellow that I'm going to mention is William Lamin. No, sorry, not that William Lamin. This William Lamin. And this William Lamin was the son of a farmer in Nottingham. And he was on the very dry sand lands that I remember experiencing when I was in my early 20s. Now, this is blowing sand, and honestly, when it blows up on these light sands, this sand literally takes to the air and is blown across vast areas of land, especially when there's no green material on the soil top. William Lamin took on this farm as a young man, and his father thought he'd gone mad. And William Lamin didn't know what to do about this, and he was a clever man. He decided that he was going to have to do something, otherwise he'd look a fool in front of his father. And he happened to read Robert Elliott's book, we've just talked about. And Robert Elliott told him, effectively through that book, how to farm this very dry land. And William Lamin came up with some lovely quotes. He wrote a book some years later, I think it was published in 1954, but he wrote a book about farming on this very light land with the Clifton Park farming system after 30 years. And it's a very good read. And a couple of things he said. Two of them I like. One of them, it's like throwing money away to put ryegrass on dry land. What he meant by that, of course, is that ryegrass, it's a great grass in some respects, but it's a very shallow-rooted plant, and of course on sand has got no moisture, it doesn't grow. And the other lovely comment that he mentioned is that the roots of the deep-rooting leys that he grew, the species like chicory and cocksfoot, would be tickling the miner's ears below the ground. Of course, in his day, in the 1950s, there was a big mining industry below his feet, and I think that's a lovely, lovely comment. The next man I want to mention is Frank Newman Turner, who was around, again, a similar time era to William Lamin. And he was another pioneer. He believed health came from the soil up. And he was you could say, I think, a herbal ley pioneer. He was very famous for saying that his herbal ley was a fertilizer merchant, a feed manufacturer, and a vet, all in one. And if you think about that, that's just such a lovely way of summing up the value that the plants had to his soil, to his animals, and to the health of his animals, and ultimately the food that he produced. And he developed many complex herbal ley mixtures and mixtures with grasses and herbs. Each ingredient was chosen to perform a particular function in providing a specific nutrient or to the animal, or to enhancing the fertility of the soil. And he wrote a lot about this, and there's some lovely books that he's produced. Again, I think you can get them online, or you can buy reprinted copies now, I've seen, which I have some actually from America. So all these things are available out there. I also want to mention, finally, a man called Sir George Stapledon, who was around during the Second World War, and he was instrumental in the Palau policy and ley farming, and he wrote a lot on this subject. He was an ecologist, actually, by profession, but he also understood the importance of grassland and the effect that it would have on the nation, at a time, of course, when the nation was struggling to feed itself. And I think he is perhaps best known for his setting up the Welsh plant breeding station at Aberystwyth. But I also think that he was a real advocate of multi-species leys. He is known for plant breeding, and he is known for the selection of clovers, but also for the development of the breeding programs with perennial ryegrass. But he was definitely at heart somebody, if you read his work, was definitely at heart somebody that believed in multiple species swards. And the more you look back to these inspirational characters, the more you realise that this cycle has been before, and we need to look again at why these men all had leys at the centre of their farming operation. They believed that the real fertility came from these grass leys. They were in times when they could get fertiliser, it was expensive or it wasn't available, but they fundamentally believed in having grass leys in the rotation. These rotations that I talk about now were based around maximising the grass and lowering the acreage of cereals. And that really flies in the face now of what is happening on arable farms. If you have 3 or 4 years of complex grass leys, and then follow that with a cash crop of some description, in this case we put a crop of turnips in, and then we go for a crop of cereal, perhaps followed by a second cereal, and then we undersow that cereal and back to our ley again, we've got a rotation. There are loads of variants on this. But what always remains the same, what remains the same in my mind, and what has always remained the same in the minds of these predecessors that we know, is that the ley is the important bit which forms the basis of soil structure and soil fertility. And that's why it takes up about 50% of the rotation. Today, I find it very frustrating that our temporary grass leys are at one of the lowest levels that they've been for this 200-year period we've just looked at. And I worry that the quality of the soil that these men before us have written about is going in the same way. I worry that the cheap cereal prices that we're trying to compete with in the UK are going to have a massive impact on our state of agriculture. And I just cannot see an end to high input costs. And I think all these people have said the same thing, and I'm really just echoing what they've said. And so really this just leads me to sort of the end of the 200-year period, because all these agriculturalists, and many people that tell me today that there needs to be a solution, and it's difficult, but the Leys do hold the key to that solution. And if you look, this was just 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, in the NFU email that I get as a member of the NFU, and it tells you of the biggest year-on-year fall in profitability for the last 10 years. And they say themselves it's an alarming statistic. This, I know this, and it just, at what point do we recognise this as a real issue for nearly every farmer in the land? There are devastating problems here that we need to do something about. So in our attempt to address this afternoon, I give you two possible options to increase profitability on farms. One is to intensify and produce more, which many farmers have done. I have been trained to do that over my 30 years, and I haven't achieved it yet, because I think whilst intensification in many respects is a good thing, producing more is a good thing, the profitability, as we can see from the information that we're provided with the whole time, is lacking. Farming without profitability, I cannot see how it can continue. So I put another alternative in to increase profit, and that is to lower the cost of production. And I think this is back to Cato's philosophy. It's especially important for farming because farmers can be self-sufficient. There are ways by using Leys to increase the fertility of the ground, of the soil, and that will lead to more profitable farming. And it's especially important for the tens of thousands of small farms in this country, because they cannot compete on large industrial scales. So for me, this is a really fundamental point, and one that I personally believe in and am part of. And if you think about what we can be the best at in this country, we have got the perfect climate for mixed farming. So to grow these Leys with our good quality soils, our temperate climate, and our ability to farm mixed farming, I just think is a bit of a, to coin the pun, a no-brainer. And that is what these previous farming examples I've given you show, and I believe that's the way we should be going more in the future. Everyone agrees that farming needs to lower its costs. My view is that grass should be grazed as much as possible because it's so cheap, and the grazed Leys will produce the most fertility for soil, which of course promotes the growth of our cash crops, and they're the best way of building soil quality because of the deep roots that these plants have. And so I just think that this is the way we should go to lower our costs. Now I want to give you a couple of modern day examples of people that I know that have done this. This is a colleague of mine in agriculture, Lyndon Edwards, and I've known Lyndon for a long time. He farms in Monmouthshire and is a good farmer. He changed a lot of his Leys to using high legume, high clover Leys back in the early 2000s. And this is a comment that he made to me at the time. He used a lot of red clover to fatten his lambs. He's got a good intensive sheep farm. He's a good farmer. And when he changed to red clover, he said, I hardly use any concentrate anymore. And it's made a big difference to his farming system. And that's a simple story that I hear so often from the hundreds of people that I speak to every year in my job. I just find this time and time and time and time again. And when you look to the science, you see why. Because the growth rate he was getting with his lambs, and this is in grams per day, it's some old work which has been repeated time and time again, shows you what happens when you use clover with grass as opposed to just using grass. The lambs eat more because they find the clover more palatable, and they convert more of that forage into meat. And it's the same with milk, and it's the same with beef, and it's the same wherever you look at it. Some of the best results, incidentally, I've seen in terms of lamb growth weight were with Sandfoin, where back in the days of the Grassing Research Institute when it was at Hurley, where there was 450 grams per day. So that's 50% more than we're showing here with the clover, but 450 grams off Sandfoin. And that's another legume which we'll talk about more in a minute. Now there's more benefits by combining legumes or clovers with grasses. This slide shows you what happens when you overlap the two species and grow them in the same space. The green line shows you the production curve for ryegrass, or any grass for that matter, and the red line shows you production curve typically for a clover, so that could be red or white clover. And you can see that if you only had the green line, come the summertime, because it's dry, your grass production would slow down. However, if you grow it with a clover, of course that overlaps, and the clover production more than makes up pretty much for the lack of grass growth. And that's a simple way of just using two different plant species. And of course you can imagine overlapping more and more species onto that graph, you get more and more coverage. About 10 years ago, another farming friend of mine, Rob Richmond, came to this very office that I'm sat in now, and explained to me that he was new to a farm in the Cotswolds, and he had a dairy unit, and he was farming very light land, and he wanted to use complex lays just like Robert Elliott had, and he wanted to develop a farming system near Cirencester that would benefit the very, very stony Cotswold brash that he had. Now this was 10 years ago. And I've been to Rob's farm many times over those years, and I can tell you that it's always green there. There's always so much forage, just like in this picture, and his cows are out nearly all year round. He's a big organic dairy farmer and is expanding his production of milk. I'd say it was a really good model example of what you can do. Of course he's on light land, of course he can graze nearly all year round, which is very different to a heavy land farm. And I will talk about the differences between light and heavy land, but Rob's a really good example of how you'd struggle to grow grass on a farm like his. I remember that farm before he went there, and there was a lot of ryegrass grown, and it had a huge amount of fertiliser to produce the grass for those cows. It was at times unsatisfactory, especially in dry weather, because the ryegrass just stopped growing. So there was a huge amount of grass being made into silage, which didn't really compare to what Rob's doing now. And he uses a mob grazing system as well, which I'll come to later on when we discuss how to manage Herbal Leys in more detail. But let me just move on from Rob's a little bit to talking about drought resistance. Because back in the day, before Rob went to that farm, he had these ryegrasses on the farm, which really did struggle in dry conditions. And it's when you look at it from an illustration point of view that you see why different plants have different abilities to withstand drought. Just look at the representation here of how the deeper rooting plants will, of course, harvest any moisture that's there. And there's just such a massive difference. Some of the grasses are deeper rooting, some of the legumes are deeper rooting, and of course some of the herbs are particularly deep rooting. We've had two wettish years in the last couple of years, and people have sort of forgotten about talking about drought resistance. But I can tell you over my time that you get 1 in 4, 1 in 5 years where it stops raining in the summer and you've got a real problem. And so for me, drought resistance is one of the most important things to get right. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the the Herbal Leys are only used in very dry areas. And I've just put together a map showing you the areas that have, according to our database of farmers that have ordered seed mixtures, that have sown deep-rooting Herbal Leys. Quite interesting, isn't it? Because you can see that there's a really big spread of farms across the whole of the UK. I'm sorry to cut the top of Scotland off, and I'm sorry to cut off some of the Channel Islands in France, but you wouldn't be able to see it on the screen otherwise if I hadn't. But there are some right up into the Scottish Highlands and to the islands of the sea, and also there's some in the Scilly Isles and some in the Channel Islands. They really are widely spread. I want to just show you something a little bit interesting though, because it does explain a bit of a mystery. If we drill into the detail, this is the Cotswold Hills. The line runs roughly from the bottom left to the top right. It's about 80 miles, and you'll see the little red dots signify where farmers are that grow Herbal Leys. Just look to the west of Cheltenham, so in other words to the sort of top left. You'll see there aren't very many Herbal Leys there. And the reason is that's the Vale of Evesham, and that is where the soils are much stronger. And what I call a Herbal Ley with 15 or 16 different species in tends to go on the hilltops, on the drier ground, on the eastern side where it doesn't rain. But in the Vale, you tend to get less Herbal Leys. So you can see that in the same region, you could have a lot of farmers growing herbal leys and actually just 5 miles away, none. And that does explain a mystery, because you'll always get differences of opinions between different farmers in the same region, but think about how they're applied, think about how they're used and why there's a difference. But the deep-rooting plants do have a role to play on these drier lands. The forage plants also have other benefits, of course, other than just dry matter yield. It's not just about the yield, it's not just about the protein content. There's some plants, for example, sainfoin and bird's foot trefoil and chicory, that have other biochemical properties. So these are plants that are, in the case of what we're talking about today with leys, can be used as natural wormers. They're anthelmintics. Now, there's very good evidence, which has been demonstrated by the Legume Plus research project recently, which was a 4-year project with a very large amount of European funding, 12 academic institutions and us as a more practical arm. It flushed out this information that we knew was there, but couldn't quite put our finger on. These tanniferous plants, particularly the sainfoin and the bird's foot trefoil, have an effect on worm burden in livestock. Particularly, we've looked at ruminant animals, and we know that by feeding relatively small quantities in the diet, we can have quite big effects on livestock health. Now, that's not only good for the livestock themselves because it's healthier, it's also good financially because farmers spend a huge amount of money on buying wormers every year. And there's wormer resistance in the pipeline. We know in parts of Europe, particularly in Europe and particularly in the sheep industry, there are big problems with wormers that are coming our way, and plants offer us a lovely way of solving that problem. These deep-rooting plants also can pick up minerals that are expensive to buy and not always available to animals, particularly animals grazing monocultures, because the plants, the shallow-rooted plants, just don't pick up and hold enough minerals that the animals can then eat. And you can see these are the sort of minerals that the deep-rooting plants like chicory and ribgrass and yarrow can mine and then transfer to the surface through the grazing animal, which the grazing animal gets the benefit of, but also we transfer these minerals onto the surface, which our arable crops can then harvest as well, and then one way or other, as humans, of course, we can get them as well, so it's even better. So don't underestimate the value of deep-rooting plants as far as minerals are concerned. And there's other things to mention as well. This is a funny illustration that I sometimes use because it shows the importance of bees. And I'm particularly talking about our wild pollinators, the bumblebees and the like, who have definitely diminished in their number. There are various theories for this. As far as I'm concerned as a plant person, I've looked at habitat because I know that the habitat that they've lost was supporting their populations. And you only have to look at the numbers that I'm looking at to see why. This shows you the tonnage of forage legume seed that's been sown for about a 40-year period. This isn't just Cotswold seeds, this is the whole of the English seed trade. Now, the reason I only have from 1961 to 1999 is because that's the data that I have in printed form, and I'm afraid the Seedsman's Annual Return, which is where I drew this information from, which we used to be part of compiling, stopped with the cuts of the Ministry of Agriculture back then in those days. But just look at the decline. So this includes red clover, white clover, sainfoin, lucerne, bird's foot trefoil, all those lovely plants that the bees were depending on as a food source and also as habitat. They've lost. So we can see why the bee population has declined just by looking at the sales of forage legume seed, because we've also lost the wildflower meadows. That's a separate matter as far as I'm concerned, but we had huge acreages of leys which contained these very valuable plants. One bit of a silver lining, I think, or hopefully a bit of sun on the horizon, is that there is an OK21 and an EK21 option within the UK's schemes now for at higher level stewardship to replace some of these habitats by growing diverse seed mixes. And I think that will help some of this problem. I also think by sowing herbal leys in just on their own, regardless of whether they're funded or not, would also help tremendously as well. Just going to turn our attention now to soil structure. Eliot, Stapledon, Lamin, Newman Turner all realised that the structure of their soil was probably of more importance than the nutrient content that the soil held. In other words, the plants that they grew on the soil or the crops that they grew, probably benefited from greater soil structure rather than just adding the chemical nutrients in from a bag. I think they were right. And I think the structure that we talk about that's so important came from deep-rooting plants. And it's really easy for us on the top of the soil to look at the plants and to say, oh yes, all these plants grow this much above ground. And it's much more difficult to look below the surface of the soil. But if you do, that's where the real work's done. And this is what I'm trying to show with this illustration. These deep roots just add so much material to the soil. To quote Eliot, he said, the cheapest, the deepest and the best cultivators, drainers and warmers of the soil are the roots. And if you think about all those things that he talks about, effectively these are cultivators. These don't need tractors. These are working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I think even Lamin said that as well in his book. These are really fantastic plants that can break pans, whether they're mechanically made plough pans or whether these are pans that are just formed by soil particles, 15 inches down below the surface. These plants go down 4 or 5 feet and they get through anything and they hardly even notice. And it's not just the fact that the roots go down, they also, of course, fix nitrogen. And they also provide habitats for our soil biology, most important. Now, I'm not a soil scientist and I don't intend to go into more detail on this today, but I do think that we underestimate the value of our main capital asset on farms, which is the soil. And we can do so much about it by growing deep-rooting plants in rotation. I've demonstrated, I think, almost categorically in my mind, that no one single species can provide everything. All the things I've touched on so far are coming from the use of multiple species mixtures. And I want to here now reiterate the importance of having mixtures of plants rather than monoculture. If you take a single grass, yes, it can provide bulk with fertiliser, nitrogen particularly, but it's vulnerable to pretty much not doing anything else very well. So it's not very good at competing with weeds. This in isolation wouldn't necessarily be a high protein plant, and so on. And it's when you add other species into the soil alongside it that it starts to get much more interesting. This is depicting putting a legume in with a grass. Obviously then we're getting deeper roots, we're getting nitrogen fixation, we're providing for our pollinators. If we add other species in, we're also doing the same thing, but more of it. We're dragging up minerals, and we're having an effect on soil structure. We're not vulnerable to drought. And I think it's when you start to combine these things together that you get more effect as time goes on, and the more years these are in the ground, the better it gets. The optimum for me, as far as duration of mixtures of plant species like this, would be around 4 years. Young Leys for a year or so just don't do it. They're good. They're really good and better than doing nothing. But they don't bring the really stable organic matter that you need to have a proper farming rotation with cash crops in as well. I'm not the first person to realise this. And I often quote this man because he's just such a good example of what I'm saying. He was one of the first people to recognise the effect by combining 2 different plants together. It's the overlapping effect, and he wrote about it in The Origin of Species, and it is without doubt a basic lesson to any agriculturalist. Grow 2 plant species together and you will definitely get more. Now, of course, in the case of forage production or in the case of building soil fertility, we don't need our plants to be ready all on the same day. In fact, that's a disadvantage. We want our plants to be overlapping each other so that the plants can provide forage from early in the year or provide root matter for later in the growing later into the season, or taking different spaces in time and place. And let me just illustrate the one single thing that, of course, all of us as farmers want to know about, and that's yield. And this is what Darwin was talking about. If I go back to those three species that we illustrated, the grass, the clover and the herb, you can see very clearly here what they would give you individually. And if you grow them in plots and you measure the yield, that's what you get. So these are tons of dry matter per hectare. So it would be natural for any of us to say, well, that's fine. If we grow those 3 things together, this is what you'd get in terms of your likely average. But that's not quite what happens. You would think that you might get a little bit more if you combine the three things together in light of what I've said, but actually you get a huge amount more. What you get is about 50% more, because all these plants are growing not only in different places in terms of their root depths, in terms of their aerial growth, but they're also growing at different times of the year. And if you think about those slides we've looked at earlier on in this discussion, the clover and the grass one overlapping their time period in the summer, for example, you see why. And so this Darwin effect is quite obvious when you start to think about it. And there's been lots of scientific work that's shown this to be true. You only need 3 or 4 species to get this effect, this 50% additional effect. You can, of course, add other things into the equation by growing more species, and that's what the Herbal Leys are doing. Let me now give you some examples of the forage plants that we're talking about, and I'm going to fly through these very quickly, but just to set the scene of what we're going to come to next about growing the mixtures. Within the forage grasses, these are the main species we use. We've got the short-term ryegrasses like Westerwolds, and we've got the longer-term ryegrasses like perennial ryegrass. We've got cocksfoot, timothy, and meadow fescue. You can grow all these together. You just have to get the proportions right. Some last longer than others, some are quicker to get going than others. So the Westerwold annual can grow really quickly. The timothy might take a year or two to get going, but when the Westerwold is gone, it's filling its place and it's producing. Turn our attention to the forage legumes. It's a similar story. We've got very fast-growing annuals that can take place right at the beginning of your lay and die away so that the weeds are competed with, but leaving underneath the long-term grasses and the long-term clovers and the long-term herbs. And as time goes on, the root structures of these get really, really deep. So you can have relatively shallow-rooted plants like white clover and very deep-rooting plants like lucerne, sainfoin, and of course the good old red clover. Probably the red clover is one of the most important species that everyone can grow, that is very, very commonly used in herbal leys as a mainstay. Let's have a quick look now at the forage herbs, just to give us an idea of the sort of things that we're talking about. Chicory, burnet, yarrow, ribgrass and parsley, sheep's parsley. Just like your garden parsley, you don't always see it, you always see the others. Chicory in a ley is very obviously there. It's the big tall one, can be 5 or 6 foot high sometimes. Takes a bit of managing, sometimes it's topped, but fundamentally it's there for its soil structure ability. It's not there because it's a high yielder in isolation, it's there for its soil structure. And so you can see that there's all these lovely plants all doing different things, they all look different, they all contribute in different ways. So when it comes to choosing your seed mix, you've got a really big armoury to choose from. And just because the seed catalogue says, well, this is what you should use, doesn't mean that that's the only choice you have. It's really important that everybody has their own take on this and everybody adapts their seed mixes to their own farm, because there is not one solution for everybody. And I'd urge everyone to make that their first priority. So when you're thinking of establishing herbal leys, you need a plan. And farming systems don't just happen. You can't just change your whole system. You have to evolve into it. And this can take many, many years, not just a few hours at the planning table. I start with the rotation first. I think it's really important that you can figure out where the rotation is going to go and how you might make subtle changes within your rotation to get the herbal leys in. Because once they're up and running, as I'll show you in a minute, then there's other things to consider. As far as the seed bed is concerned, well, I don't think there's much alternative but to plough and to create a seedbed in the traditional way to get a seedbed for your ley. Min-till systems or no-till systems are fine, but for me, grass leys are better sown into a well-worked seedbed. And we are literally going often from plough to a rolled surface here, as you can see on the left, and to get that is really, really important. And if I just show you on this next slide the size of the seed that we're talking about. This is a clover seed, and you can see at the end of the tip of that yellow arrow how small these seeds are. They're tiny. If we haven't got a decent seed bed, I'm afraid they're just not going to grow. Knobbly seed beds don't work. And so you have to sort of say to yourself, well, what is the best way of sowing it? Do you undersow or do you direct sow? There is no right or wrong answer. Both methods work. There's advantages for both. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people consider the high clover lays as undersowable lays is that you can get 2 crops at once. There's a nurse crop, there's in this case a barley that is combined, leaving underneath it a lay which is very spindly but eventually gets there. But I know plenty of other people, and myself I've had experiences of both, where direct sowings can be every bit as good as undersowings. And so I think it depends on your rotation, on what your plan is as to which you adopt. But you have to figure out your own. And I think one of the best ways of doing it is to talk to other people, see what kits you have, see what time you have, where your rotation gaps are in order to address that problem. But both methods work. And then, of course, you get to the question, well, should I drill it or should I broadcast it? This is a bit of an easier one. There are some drills that are actually very capable of shallow sowing small seeds. You've seen the picture of the little seed. They are very small indeed. If you drop the seed on the surface, as is shown on the left here, with a tine harrow with a seeder attachment on it, it's fine. It can't really go very deep. And the same is true with the really good small seed drills like here, the Aitchison, or there's the Moore Unidrill. There are others too. They can control the depth to a very good extent, and the seeds don't go in too deep. And I know that if we have plant clover seeds more than 1 centimetre, more than ½ inch, they just don't come through. So you really do have to get them into the shallowest zone you possibly can. And so for me, that's probably broadcast or just drilled into the surface with a proper drill. But whatever you do, make sure the seed bed is well consolidated. You really don't want to have a loose seed bed because you'll lose the seed in it. So rolling it first, very often rolling it before you drill is the way to go, and definitely rolling it afterwards. Now, I'm conscious that time's moving on, but I have just got a section at the end which I'm hoping will just wrap this up really nicely, and it's all about managing herbal lays, because the reasons why we do it are, to me, very clear. The theory behind how we do it are very clear. How you select them is becoming clearer, but managing them is one of the things that people often find as a barrier. And I want to try and just illustrate some things that I know firsthand, which I can explain in some simplicity, I hope. So the initial grazing, once your lay's in, when do you do that? Well, this is an example of showing initial grazing in the year of sowing a herbal lay. This was last year, and this lay was sown in May. And if you remember, last year was a wet year, it was a cold spring, it was a late sowing, so it was sown in May, and then it was grazed here in October. Now, it wasn't heavily grazed, and very often there wouldn't be enough to graze from a summer sowing like this, but there was last year because there was lots of rain. So you have to use a judgment, and so these lays, there isn't a black and white answer to this question, when should I actually graze it? But you have to be careful, you have to look very closely, you have to keep these animals moving through. You don't want them sat on here for 6 weeks, destroying your lovely young lay and nibbling out, in the case of sheep, nibbling out all those lovely plants like chicory and sandford, which they will murder, literally, in their first year. So that's the first thing. But I think the one that really gets everyone talking is how should they be managed? Should they be cell grazed? Should they be mob grazed? Should they be rotationally grazed? Should they be set stocked? Well, let's just run through very quickly. This is set stocking. So these animals go where they like, when they like. If there was trees here, there's water here, they'd probably go and lie by the water when they want to. They certainly would be selectively grazing what they want. You'd have a field that was all over the place. So for me, I don't think this system is very good. What's better is a rotational grazing system. So our field here is divided up into relatively small areas, and the animals are confined to a degree. And you'd probably in this situation move them every week or maybe every 2 weeks, and you'd move them round in a rotation. It's better. But I think the really interesting bit for the future is mob grazing. And mob grazing is where animals are tightly packed into a smaller area. Mob or cell grazing is the same thing. Now, I do this myself, I'm experimenting with it, and I know lots of other people are as well. So Rob Richmond would be one of those. Now Rob Richmond, in the case of this is the dairy farmer, remember that I spoke about earlier on, he has about an acre of herbal lay that he gives his 100 heifers, his dairy replacement heifers, every day. So he's moving those every day. His cows, of course, his milking cows are moved more than once a day because he's milking them. So it's difficult to give you exact numbers on that, but Rob always judges how much he's moving because, of course, throughout the year the amount of material comes and goes. So 1 acre feeds about 100 heifers. 1 acre also feeds about 100 ewes with about 200 lambs, and that's what I'm doing. But it does vary on the time of year, the breed of the animal we're talking about, the amount of rainfall we've had in the year and so on. But the one thing you've got to do is you've just got to keep it moving on. And roughly speaking, a 30 to 50 day interval allows the material to come back up. So in other words, allows regrowth on the plants that were grazed 30 or 50 days ago. Now, in order to do this, you need to have some equipment. And this is a very simple run through of what you need and how it works. You need some form of power. It could be a battery. It could be mains electricity. You need an energizer, and then you need a post system. Now, there are lots of systems. I went to Rapper for my fencing. They were very helpful. They gave me everything I needed. And after a short period of time, it was actually, I thought it'd be a few hours. It was actually a couple of days. I was able to set up a lovely system which is movable, and I move sheep now every day with this, and it works really, really well. But you do need the time and the thought to set it up. You also need to have the ability to manage it. So from time to time, things need moving. I'm cutting there with an Allen scythe on the left. It's a little thing that cuts. It's a scissor bar finger mower underneath the wire, and it stops it shorting out. You just need one or two bits of kit that enable you to do it. I don't have enough animals or a big enough farm to justify running on a quad bike, but a lot of people use quad bikes or Land Rovers with the 3-reel system. If you're a cattle farmer, of course, you're lucky because you only need one strand of wire, but for sheep you need 3. But it isn't a big deal. Myself and my wife do it, and we love doing it, and it's a nice job for us to do. We see the sheep every day and everyone's happy. They need water. This is a simple water trough. This is on a low pressure valve. We actually have got mains on the farm. We've also got spring supply, but where this land is, we're feeding off a bowser, or we're feeding the trough off a bowser. That trough is only small. You can see the scale with the spanner there, but it's fed off a 1,000 litre bowser, and the bowser is changed filled up every week. And it isn't an issue. I wouldn't want to be doing this, with carting anything else around it. You need some form of automation, but it doesn't have to be expensive. And the point about this is the grazing does need to be controlled. And there's the reason that we would mod graze like this is that we just get so much more grass that we can graze. And for so much more of the season, we can extend the season right from the beginning, right through to the end, and accumulate material with this system that we can graze into the winter, well into the winter. We're lucky, again, we have dry ground. We have wet ground too, but we use the dry ground, obviously, for grazing in the winter. And the reason that we graze is because it's cheaper. It's £1 million cheaper. It really is so much less expensive. To make hay or haylage or silage is expensive, and so I would urge people not to go down that road where they don't have to, and to graze in situ, because it's so much better. Now, just going back to the rotation quickly, I want to just mention how we get from a grass lay to a cereal crop, because a lot of people ask this question. I don't think it's acceptable to go from a grass lay to a cereal crop, particularly if you've got a deep rooting lay with lots and lots of material structure, as roots in the soil. It's really difficult to get a seed there. So to go from a grass lay, to plough a grass lay, plant a turnip crop, in this case it could be forage rate, it could be kale, and then to put the cereal in after that. So these animals would graze over the winter. So we'd take a silage crop now, or a graze now, followed by plough, follow the turnips, and then the cereal crop next year, next spring. Of course, the fertility is there, and it's a lovely way of getting a seedbed for the cereal. I think it's a really nice system. And then finally, just very quickly, I want to tell you a little bit about overseeding. I'm not convinced this is the way to introduce herbal lays into swards. The lay on the right there, well, it's not a lay, it's permanent pasture, is really thick and dense. It's very difficult to get new species establishing, especially the slower ones. And of course, a lot of the more desirable ones are the slower ones, the chicory and the sandfoins and things like that. People do it, it is possible. It's much better with the reseed, in my opinion. And just to sort of wrap up, conclude what I've said, I want to tell you very briefly about my story. This is Honeydale Farm, is in the Cotswolds. It's a small farm which we took on in 2013. We never thought we'd have a small farm for home, and we were really, really fortunate to get this farm. For the first 12 months, we continued to farm exactly as the previous farmer had, which was interesting, and we thought, well, it's the way to learn the most we could about this farm. There's a reason the farmer farmed it like this, so we thought we'll find out. We changed nothing. We were a conventional farm. A lot of the land was spring barley, which we continued to grow. And here's a lovely photograph of my wife looking across this fine fine fields of spring barley, and they were wonderful. They looked a picture, and it was a lovely summer sight. And she was mightily impressed with my ability to grow this crop. But look at the numbers on the top left, which, when she saw those numbers, she was not so impressed, because she realised, like many of us, that actually, this conventional system was broken effectively and was not sustainable financially. So after our first experience, we of course looked for reasons why, and I can tell you why. Here's one example. The nitrogen fertiliser that was applied was jolly expensive, and you all know that the cost has been racking up over the years, and of course the barley price hasn't. Even though we managed to get a malting premium on the barley, we still haven't seen much of an increase in the barley for years and years, but we have seen a massive increase in fertiliser. So what we've done is we've changed our cropping system completely, and we have developed a rotation. We've gone from monoculture, spring barley and permanent grass to a really interesting rotation, which another day I'll get the opportunity hopefully to explain. But just suffice it to say, our farm now looks like this, and this is last month on Herbal Leys. And that's the same field that we were looking over the spring barley. And it's a picture. And I have to tell you, it's sort of rewarding and satisfying and all things in one go. This is such a nice thing to do, because I know we're building fertility in that field, and I know that field needs it more than anything else. That all the fields across the top of our farm were brash and really, really hungry ground. And when you think about the prospects for arable farming, I mean, I just don't want to rely on the markets changing and having a good year now and again. I think the economic prospects for arable farming are really bleak, and it worries me that we have all spent so much money and time and effort, developing a system that does appear to be financially unsustainable. I also think that there is a solution in this, and sometimes you've sort of got to be pushed to the edge to find it. And I think that one of the things that I've seen people do, a lot of the people I know, a lot of my friends in agriculture, have improved soils. And I think that ley farming system improves soils more than anything else. I'm all for cover crops and green manures and things like that, but I think the ley farming system is the ultimate. It is the Rolls Royce of farming systems. And when you say to yourself, what are we best at here in the UK? What can we be the best at in the world? It's that lovely way of looking at your sales and marketing. Well, it's pretty obvious to me that it's this farming system, it's this ley farming system, this herbal ley farming system, or this type of principle of it, that stood the test of time for effectively 200 years. And it's not surprising, because we have got the perfect climate for it. And at that point, I just think you go back to Cato and you say, what is it we can do best? What is it that we can do cheaply and be self-sufficient in, and be a seller and not a buyer? And that's it. And that's my time up, I believe.